Thank you, everyone who's here today joining us. I really appreciate the turnout on a rainy Friday afternoon if you're in the Pacific Northwest. We are joined today by the brilliant Stefan Sanandan Hanish to present accessibility in research from design to dissemination. And we would like to begin, before we get any further into our own introductions, with an acknowledgement of the traditional lands that bring us together today. And those are the lands on which Royal Roads University rests. The traditional lands of the Kasapsum and Lekwungen ancestors and families, now known as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. Those families have lived on the lands on which Royal Roads rests for thousands of years, and we are so incredibly grateful to be able to learn and work there, and for that space that made this presentation possible. I also want to acknowledge the as we have on the first slide here, the funding for this piece of research came from the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and we're very grateful to them for the opportunity to pull this together in a way that is open access and hopefully will be beneficial to our whole community. So my name is Gwen Thompson-Hill. I am a queer, cis, neurodivergent woman. I was raised on the lands of the Anishinaabe-Huron First Nations, and I'm currently speaking to you from my home office on the lands of the Seacom First Nation. I am joining you today in my capacity at Royal Roads as the Manager of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in Research. And I'm so pleased to hand the virtual microphone over to Stefan Sanandan Hanish to introduce himself now.
Very much, Gwen. My name is Stefan Sanandan Hanish, and I'm a disabled researcher, educator, and musician based at the University of British Columbia, where I'm an honorary research associate and sessional lecturer at the Department of Theatre and Film. On my mother's side of the family, I am East Indian, and on my father's side of the family, I am German, and I was born in Canada. Today, I am joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam First Nation.
And I do want to say before we move to the access check, sorry, Stefan, just going to jump in here. Thank you for those of you who didn't hear that initially. Thank you to Melanie Roble for supporting the technical side of this session, and to Raven Barron, who is joining us as our captioner to provide live transcription.
So, at this point in the presentation, Gwen and I would like to do an access check, and we'd like to ask how is the lighting, how is the sound, and we also invite you to let us know of any changes that we can make to this Zoom space before we start our presentation. So we'll just maybe wait a minute or two, and we would ask you to write your feedback in the chat window, both to let us know of any changes that you might like us to make where possible, and then also if the lighting and sound and everything works for you, please also feel free to let us know that as well.
And I see a few thumbs up from folks that I can see, and folks using the thumbs up function on Zoom, so that's great. And Scott has said loud and clear for sound and lighting. Perfect. Thank you so much from Sona. Thank you. This is great.
Yeah. And I'll also just say a few words about this practice of doing an access check. This is adapted from Neil Simkin's 2020 essay, The Sticky Note Snap, in an edited volume titled Enacting a Culture of Access in Our Conference Spaces. And this is co-edited by Adam Hubrig and Ruth Osorio. And I believe Melanie will be sharing a link to this edited collection for those of you who may be interested in finding out more about these kinds of proactive approaches to accessibility.
Thank you for that. And I think what we'll do is we will share links once we get to the Q&A section. And I should also say that if you do have questions, feel free to put them into the chat as they come to you. We will probably go through the full presentation and then pause at the end for questions, at which point we'll be stopping the recording as well, just in case there's any sensitive information that we don't want to share. So for now, I'm going to begin by giving a bit of a background on the development of this toolkit. So in 2019, Royal Roads received funding from the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, as I've already mentioned. The purpose of that funding was to eliminate barriers to inclusion within research at Royal Roads. And we almost immediately discovered that it is impossible to divorce the research environment from the university writ large, and then of course the university from the community, and so on and so forth until you get to the Canadian ecosystem that is impacting the research that we do here at Royal Roads. So we started to reach out in a more focused way over the past year on barriers to accessibility. And we found there's so much information on how to include people with disabilities in the work that we do and in research specifically, but it exists in so many disparate locations and it's really hard to know where to look. So I got in touch with Stefan and we decided to build a toolkit that lays all of this out really clearly and simply and explains how people with disabilities are excluded systemically from research, and then how research can be designed to be intentionally inclusive. And it's worth noting that if research is not designed to be intentionally inclusive, then it is being designed unintentionally to be exclusive. Well, I do want to talk a bit about framing the need for this within Canadian higher education. I'm not going to go too deep into the statistics here, and a little grain of salt for when we talk about, particularly about disability statistics. There is still so much stigma around disability, around talking about it and disclosing it, that statistics have to be kind of given a margin of error that acknowledges that we may be running up against an unwillingness to disclose. So as of 2019 in Canada, we have the Accessible Canada Act. And the purpose of that act is to make Canada barrier-free by January 1st, 2040. And a barrier under the act, I just want to give the definition that they offer for that act, is anything that hinders the full and equal participation in society of persons with an impairment, including physical, mental, intellectual, cognitive, learning, communication, or sensory impairment, or a functional limitation. So it's worth knowing when you're working with the Accessible Canada Act that that's the definition they're working with. In 2017, Statistics Canada released the results of the Canadian Survey on Disability. That's the last time that was done. They do it every 5 years, so we should be seeing some more results fairly soon. So they found that 22% of the Canadian population aged 15 years and over, and that's about, just for context, 6.2 million people, had one or more disabilities. And that report can tell us something about how different aspects of being marginalized within society intersect with having a disability in Canada. So within, and I'll just give a couple of examples, within that 22% statistic, the prevalence of disability increases with age. And they found that women were more likely to have a disability than men, and that mental health related disabilities were more prevalent in youth. So that's, according to Statistics Canada, youth is ages 15 to 24. And importantly, that people with disabilities are less likely to be employed. So there's a significant socioeconomic intersection of marginalization with people with disabilities or disabled people. And we'll talk about that verbiage in a little bit. Finally, when we look at our faculty in Canada, people with disabilities account for about 22% of faculty. That number drops significantly to 4.5% when you get to our senior leadership in universities. And again, think about that stigma and marginalization that may be preventing disclosure. But this matters in terms of leadership, because how we design our education systems and our research pathways is dependent upon institutional leadership. So the more representative our leadership is, the more inclusive our strategic pathways end up being. Now, I shared the definition from the Accessible Canada Act. I'd like to share a couple of definitions just for some shared understanding today. Accessibility, for the purposes of this session, we are defining as how well a person with atypical ways of thinking, communicating, sensing, or moving can easily navigate an environment. And I say this session, I should also say within the toolkit that we're talking about today. And when we talk about access needs, we are talking about the modifications to the typical environment that a person needs in order for that environment to become accessible. So this toolkit has 3 framing sections that I'm going to ask Stefan to talk about in a minute here, 4 sections on research design itself, 1 on data collection and analysis, and 1 on dissemination. And we're going to go through some key takeaways and a little bit of an explanation of how to use the toolkit itself. And with that, virtual mic back over to you, Stefan.
Thanks, Gwen. So, within this toolkit, there are certain accessibility practices that Gwen and I have implemented, and these are based significantly on principles of accessible document design. And we offer a summary of the kinds of accessibility practices that we've included within the toolkit. So, for example, we use Microsoft Word's built-in headings. We've also used a font called Atkinson Hyperlegible Font, which is available open access through the Braille Institute, and I believe this will also be a resource that we're sharing out with those of you who may be interested. The Braille Institute has made the Atkinson Hyperlegible Font available for both print for both web and print formats and modalities. So using this font in the toolkit allows us to, in some sense, push the boundaries of what is possible in terms of imagining accessible practices in a document and how a document is conceived and put together. And we've thought of this in terms of 3 main categories of accessibility: visual accessibility, cognitive accessibility, and navigation accessibility. And we've also, throughout the collaborative process of putting this toolkit together, we've been thinking about and talking about conflicting access needs, the possibility that in certain situations, trying to create improve access for an individual or group of end users may, in fact, inadvertently create access barriers for another individual end user or group of end users. One example that might be useful to think about in this context has been brought forward, and we include this as a further reading within the toolkit. But if open captions rather than closed captions are used within the context of video or film, what can end up happening is people who are hyperlexic and who pay close attention to written text might experience an access barrier because there is no customization possible. The captions are automatic and cannot be switched off, whereas if the captions are closed, then individual end users and audiences and learners can use the caption function based on their individual needs. And we've been mindful throughout the process of putting this toolkit together that it is not possible to anticipate any and all access needs in advance. And for this reason, our approach is collaborative and open-ended. And as we'll make clear throughout this presentation, we welcome feedback and suggestions on modifications and changes to the toolkit in an open-ended way. And I'll just say a few more words about the accessibility practices in the document, specifically in terms of the use of the American Psychological Association, or APA style, which is, depending on which discipline one conducts research in, might be the citation and reference style that's used. We've adapted this to avoid using symbols such as the ampersand. And the intention there is to facilitate access for people who use screen readers and other assistive technology, and also to improve the overall readability and user-friendliness of the toolkit. We've made another set of adaptations to APA style, which we detail in the toolkit itself. Earlier, I referenced our interest in thinking with and through the possibilities of conflicting access needs. And another basic or important principle of accessibility when it comes to research and just thinking about accessibility in general is to provide more than one way for end users to engage with the material. And this is something that we will return to throughout the presentation. I see that there was a question about the difference between closed captioning and open captioning. And then a follow-up that I understand the difference now. This is from Deborah Zorns. So this can be something that we return to certainly at the end of the presentation during the question and answer session, if that would be fine. And I'd be happy to expand on the difference between closed and open captions further as needed. So in terms of the background to this toolkit, Gwen has already summarized some of the questions and the concerns and the issues that have given rise to this toolkit. And in terms of the gaps in literature on accessibility in research, as somebody who does research myself as a disabled person, one gap in the literature on accessibility in relation to research that has been especially prominent for me has to do with the relatively limited ways in which disabled people are imagined to participate in research. So there are existing resources on designing accessible surveys, for example, and also for improving access for people who participate in interviews and so forth as participants in research. But part of my own interest in collaborating in this work is thinking about the many different ways in which disabled people can not only co-create knowledge with researchers, but also be leaders and creators of knowledge as faculty who design research projects, for example. So, and then also people, there might be many different ways in which disabled people use research and engage with published research. So a significant aspect of this toolkit is just to highlight the range of ways in which disabled people can participate in research. When earlier noted that we would be returning to some of the verbiage related to disability and language, and in thinking about accessibility and working to improve accessibility within a research context, disability and language is a central concern because it is so important to questions of identity. And our intention in bringing this forward in the toolkit is certainly not to be proscriptive. And in this, we're aligning with other work led by disability advocacy groups and disability-led organizations. So the two main categories of disability and language that are helpful for us to think about are disability first language and person first language. So you may have noticed that in introducing myself and in referring to myself, I refer to myself as a disabled researcher, as a disabled person. For me, as a wheelchair user and as somebody who has a stutter, my disabilities are central to how I move through the world, how I experience the world, how I interact with others. And so my use of disability language reflects my identity as a disabled person, and I therefore embrace disability first language. There are other people with disabilities who use person first language, in which the goal is to foreground that somebody is an individual and a person who happens to have a disability. And for people who embrace person first language, they might want others to know that for them, their disabilities are not definitive of who they are and of how they experience the world. To some extent, there is a distinction, or there are sort of general tendencies among physically disabled people to embrace and also neurodivergent people. So, for example, many autistic people embrace disability or identity first language and refer to themselves as autistic people. And for myself, as a physically disabled person, I also align with many other physically disabled people in embracing disability as inseparable from my identity. For people with intellectual, cognitive, and developmental disabilities, because of very specific histories of institutionalization, of dehumanization, of stigma around intellectual and developmental and cognitive disabilities, there is very often a preference for person-first language. But what Gwen and I would like to emphasize, and what we try to emphasize throughout the toolkit, is that language is contested and that there is no universal agreement on disability inclusive language, and there doesn't need to be. And a good practice is always to ask respectfully about individual preferences. And depending on the specific research context in which you might be engaged, there will likely be many different ways of asking those questions and having those conversations. So at this point, I would like to pass the virtual microphone back to Gwen.
Thank you so much. And we do have a question about that, so we will get to that once we get to the end of the session. I am now going to talk a little bit about research design and accessibility in research design. And I want to start with the core principles that we highlight in the toolkit. So one of the most important parts of doing research is the design phase, and that's where we create a base of accessibility and inclusion. This toolkit talks a lot about Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. The Universal Design for Learning, and I'm just going to quote from their principles, addresses, quote, factors such as physical, emotional, behavioral, neurological, and cultural issues that impact learning, teaching, and research by promoting inclusion, end quote. So the core principles of UDL are multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression. And that means that we think about integrating those multiple ways and means in ways that make sure that things like, for example, consent forms for research participants are available as audio recordings as well as text, that the text versions work with screen readers, and then having that kind of accessibility built in means nobody has to ask for it. And in the world of stigmatization around access needs, making it so that people don't have to ask will broaden your participant pool. And again, we're talking 22% of the Canadian population. So this is not a small amount of people, not a small amount of research participants. We do want to go beyond those initial access needs and consider how the specific questions that you're asking can be framed to allow everyone, so your team, participants, stakeholders, and reviewers, more than one point of access into the study. In the toolkit, each section has questions that you can ask yourself. So if you are in the design phase, you can ask yourself, for example, how do the individual components of my study, including question, theoretical framework, method of data collection and analysis, and presentation of findings, use different ways to perceive, understand, and communicate information? And just a reminder that when we design for accessibility, we are making all of the products that we design better for everyone. There is no downside to designing for accessibility. I think the downside that people see initially is that it's going to be a fair bit of work. It really isn't. Once it becomes part of your practice, it's fairly simple and it doesn't take a lot of time, and you can really increase the applicability and therefore the quality of your research. The next section we have is easy read and plain language. So when you're working on developing a research proposals, one of the hardest things to do is to ensure that the writing that you create is accessible. And that's, I mean, we all get caught in knowing our field so well that it's really difficult to remember what is plain language and what's jargon. So, and that happens, I think, to subject matter experts across the spectrum from what I've seen. So framing this as an accessibility need in your mind and for others can help you to explain it and to keep it front of mind when you're writing. And that, I should say, works for the proposal stage. It also impacts your dissemination stage and any of the materials you create in the interim. So two of the most important questions we want to be asking ourselves during proposal development are, who are the intended and potential audiences for my research, and what expertise can I reasonably expect my reviewers and readers to have? So this section of the toolkit includes links to resources that highlight the overlap between accessible design principles. And those principles generally promote inclusion and accessibility and helps you to meet the needs of a diverse readership. And that is the goal of research. We want to be able to get this out into the world in a way that is as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. The next section we have is designing inclusive research teams. I've talked a little bit already in the introduction here about the importance of representation. So I just want to re-emphasize that that's also true within research teams. So you'll be able to more easily create inclusion with a representative team. And it's important to ask yourself when you're in the design and development phase of research, who is part of my research team and who is missing? And that second part is really important. So knowing that no research team can account for every piece of lived experience, but just note who is missing and make it explicit, make it clear, something that you clearly know. And in asking that, you might also want to look at what barriers and processes of exclusion exist at your university. And this is not in order to be judgmental, but in order to recognize and account for these barriers and processes of exclusion. And once you've gone through the exercise to hopefully develop an inclusive research team, and we'll talk a little bit about how to fill those gaps in a few minutes, consider how it might evolve, because access needs change every day. What we need, either as people with disabilities or as people without disabilities who may become disabled over the period of research being conducted, those are going to change regularly. So think about how the specific kinds of research methods, the research environment that you work in could prevent full participation by disabled people or people with disabilities, and then have a bit of a plan in mind or written down as to how you'll respond to that. And that helps you to be prepared, but it also helps to create that sense of this is not a burden, this is an effort to ensure that we are as inclusive as possible and that we're hearing as many voices as possible so that our work is as applicable and as quality as possible. So finally, I'm going to talk a bit about budgeting for accessibility, and this is the last of those 4 research design sections. Budgeting is often one of the final things that we do when we are thinking about research design. We want to talk again about emergent needs. So we just discussed those emergent disability needs are challenging to plan for. Certainly not impossible. This section of the toolkit offers some ideas for how you can get started. So there are some fixed budget items that we can plan for that will include the accessibility of your research. So things like translation, closed captioning services, live captioning technology, and captionists like we have today, speech to text technology. There's quite a few assistive softwares that can be included in a budget. So this kind of assistive technology can make all of the difference in how people with disabilities can participate in your research, and also just how many of them can participate in your research. We would also recommend in this section and beyond, collaborating with disability-led organizations. And when I talk about filling gaps in inclusive team design, this is what I'm talking about. This will help the input and leadership of disabled people or people with disabilities in all phases of your research. Just speaking from the perspective of someone who works with a lot of federal funding, there are a lot of collaborative grants that can be done with community organizations. And so you can actually help to ensure that you are providing funding for disability-led organizations that may be nonprofit or NGOs, and then have some stakeholder input into the design of your research. And finally, hire subject matter experts. Again, speaks to filling those gaps in the team design and can support your team in areas where you may just miss something and not even know that you're missing it. This ensures that your research budget will properly compensate disabled people for their time, their labor, and their expertise. And that's a really important principle of EDI, is proper compensation. And with that, I will pass the virtual microphone back to Stefan to talk about data collection and analysis.
Thank you very much, Glenn. For this section of the toolkit on data collection and analysis, the slide here identifies location, people, possible access barriers, and responding to access barriers. With respect to thinking about each of these categories in relation to the research that you might be involved in, these basic categories are by no means exhaustive, but they're helpful for thinking about accessibility in relation to what at least one disability studies scholar, Jay Dolmage, calls in relation to universal design for learning. He uses the phrase places to start. And this is one aspect that I think Gwen and I have been emphasizing and we've been thinking a lot about, is that in doing this work on accessibility, in some sense, we're always starting from a particular set of practices and then continually building through dialogue and input from a range of stakeholders. So our toolkit invites you to think about why accessible modes of data collection and analysis matter in the context of your research. So some guiding questions for reflecting on might include where and with whom will my research be conducted, and what are the possible access barriers. As we've noted earlier, it's not possible to anticipate and fully meet all access needs, all possible access needs in advance, but certainly by starting with accessibility as a central concern and one that is inseparable from all phases of research, from design to our present topic, which is data collection and analysis. Just by foregrounding accessibility, this starts the process already of thinking about the kinds of access barriers that might be in place in particular environments, and depending on the type of research being conducted. And then thinking about this can also be a way to reflect on the kinds of mechanisms in place to respond to access barriers that cannot be known prior to the start of data collection. And our accessibility in research toolkit also includes a section on dissemination. And in many ways, the question of dissemination of research findings is increasingly complicated, increasingly exciting in some ways, because of new opportunities for engaging in research and sharing research findings out. But as with so many new possibilities, these new possibilities also come with, in some cases, familiar barriers to access, and in some cases, relatively new barriers to access that might be identified or sort of come to light only as some new platforms emerge. A really helpful principle to keep in mind is that advanced planning is essential. This is a theme that we return to both in today's presentation and also in the toolkit. So for conferences, symposia, and learning events, the past 2+ years of switching so many conferences and classes and other events to online platforms have shown many of us that this can indeed be done. So many of the possibilities for participation that were often closed off to disabled people prior to COVID have in some sense expanded because of the possibilities of participating in conferences both in online formats and then also perhaps increasingly now in hybrid forms. But regardless of the actual platform and modality or set of modalities, advanced planning to take into account questions of accessibility is always essential. In terms of publication, journals such as the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies and the Journal of Teaching Disability Studies, just by way of disclosure, I do have some connection to the Journal of Teaching Disability Studies. Some years ago, I was invited to join their editorial board. And then I've got a pending invitation to join the editorial board of the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies as well. Both of these publication venues demonstrate effective methods for supporting a variety of access needs in the dissemination of research. So, for example, to give two concrete examples of how this might work or how this does work in practice, with the Journal of Teaching Disability Studies, the articles that are published in this online journal can be downloaded in MS Word format. And with the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies, the articles are available in PDF format. And the editorial team works at all stages of the publication process to ensure that the PDFs are designed to be maximally accessible. And mindful of the time, I think that at this point I will maybe stop talking about dissemination, and I'll pass the virtual microphone back to Gwen. And I'll also just very quickly note that I briefly referred to my stutter earlier. This is one other disability that I have, and so sometimes it just takes me a bit longer to say things, but I do my best, and so I will pass things back to Gwen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. That's wonderful. We are right on the dot, 2:45, and before we stop the recording, I just want to say that this presentation, this video, will be uploaded to the royalroads.ca/research website. It will, so you can find it under the EDI, and then there's a resources page is where it will be. The transcript of this will also be uploaded there. It will be saved. We'll have the slides there saved as an accessible PDF if anybody wants to download them. And then just part of that PDF, before we go to the Q&A, there are some references in here that are just really excellent referral and starting points for anyone who's looking to dive a little more deeply into this, and also any kind of statistics that we may have mentioned throughout the course of this presentation are noted in here.